All right, so I went back and watched the 2008 NASCAR Sprint Cup Series season, the first full season of the car tomorrow, and a season that isn't really looked back on fondly, mostly due to the fact that it was the quote original Big Three season end quote. But what are my thoughts on 2008 and how the season worked out? Well, it was it was a season. I'll call it that. It wasn't the worst season I've ever watched. I feel like 2015, 2019 kind of take that, but it wasn't good by any means. 2008 was not that great. As a whole, after watching the 36 races, the average rating ends up at a 65.3. That's once again in terms of average rating only better than 2015 and 2019. It's even lower than 2017, 2018, stuff like that. Easily, by far, the worst COT season. It's not even close. Now, why was it like that? Well, it's kind of weird because there weren't that many really bad races. I think I only gave like 5 races below a 50. The issue is that there were a lot of races from like the 50 to 60, like whatever mark, right? There were a lot of races that fell in like a 50 or a low to mid 60. And with it just kind of outweighed everything, and it kept that average right around that middle 60 range, where it's like so many 50s and so many 60s that just kept it right there. And there weren't that many great races to even pick it up. I think I only gave 4 races a great rating, and 2 of them were super speedways. So it was just one of those seasons where everything was just average, and it didn't really work out all that well. And there were some issues with some things that didn't help the season as well. I almost kind of would rank it near like a 2022 type of season. And I don't know if that's just because first season with a whole new car that is completely different. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Um, One of the big things on my mind as well going through it was whenever 2018 was happening, like whenever 2018 was the present, people were comparing that season to 2008. And so entering into the season, I went, yes, the big three season, 3 guys combined to win 24 of the 36 races. And then the next highest race win amount was 2 by Kane, Burton, and Biffle. So I was kind of wondering, like, I wonder if it's gonna be just like 2018, where like there, I, I was really interested to see if it would kind of rank out like 2018. In fact, 2018 actually ranked better than it, and I think the only reason that happened. So the interesting part about 2008 versus 2018, 2018 had more poor races, right? It had more races that were down in like the below 50, right? As I mentioned, 2008 I gave 5 races below a 50 rating. In 2018, I gave one, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So there are already more there. However, I also gave 7 races in 2018, 86 or higher, which is to be a great race. In 2008, I only gave 4 races, 86 or higher, and 3 of them were 86. The highest was at a 90. In 2018, the highest was a 95, and then a 94, and then some 92s as well. So the thing that really differentiated 2018 from 2008 is the fact that there weren't as many average races. There were really good races and really bad races. In 2008, a lot of it was there were decent races or there were subpar races, right? That was the bulk of the season. Whereas in 2018, there was never really like an average. The average in 2018, there were very few 60s and 50s, right? Because it just like It was either it was really good and it was fun, or it just did not work out at all. And 2008 wasn't really like that. It was just kind of average throughout. So while you're watching the season, it was almost kind of grueling because you were like, I really hope this next one's really good because you can't take too many average races in a row. You really want, really good races don't have to happen all the time, right? If you have some average races and some good races there, that's fine. But you really want some great races in between, like, every 7 races or something to get a really good race so that you can go and be like, oh, that was fun to watch, and it kind of helps uplift the season. But 2008 didn't really have that. And I think that's why, when 2008 gets a 65.3 out of 100 and 2018 is 2 whole points higher at a 67.5, that's why 2018 just had more really good races, and it kind of, well, it helped the second half with the flow. The first half didn't really have too many, like it had Bristol and Richmond and Phoenix and whatever. But yeah, 2008 was just weird. There was never really any stability in terms of like, oh, maybe the first half of the season was bad, the second half was good, or vice versa. It wasn't really like that. It was just kind of like sprinkled throughout as a weird mess of races. And yeah, I didn't really favor 2008. But one of the interesting things about 2008 is that it was the first full season of the Car of Tomorrow, now known as the 5th generation stock car for the Cup Series. And since it was the first season, it was always getting compared to the Gen 4 car, as they called it, the car of yesterday. So, I'm here to now talk about the differences between the Gen 4 and the COT that I found so interesting and never really thought of until it was brought up. So, Fox, TNT, and ESPN, all 3 broadcasting partners, would mention how insanely different the cars are to drive. And obviously, I mean, that's kind of an obvious, right? Is that the Gen 4 drove nothing like the COT. What I never really thought of was that the COT was harder to drive than the Gen 4 at points. What do I mean by that? Is that they had to lift off so much more. The grip in the COT was not there at all. COT is a very low downforce car with very low grip. The Gen 4, while it is still low grip and low downforce, was nowhere near as low as the COT was. There were points during the season where they would go on board with someone, you would hear them working the throttle through the corner. They go into a corner, and they let off the gas, and you'd see like them use the brake, right? They'd use brake all the way to the middle of the corner. And then in the middle of the corner when they're trying to get back on the gas, you hear, it's like they have to wait to get back on the gas. And every time they did that, especially like in the first part of the Fox thing, first part of TNT, first part of ESPN, they'd be like, it's crazy to hear that because in the Gen 4 car, you go down to the corner, you'd let off, you'd maybe use a little bit of brake, but then you just, once you get back on the gas, you'd nail the gas, and you wouldn't have to breathe back in. Whereas with the COT, you could not just get right back on the gas. You had to let it breathe through the corner, and then you could finally mash it once you're basically going straight on exit. A very low grip car and a very low downforce car. I think that's a lot of the reason why I like it probably more than the Gen 4. Just because you have, like, the center of the corner speeds are insane to look at in the COT days. For example, the last race I watched, Homestead, right? They're entering into the corner, high 180s, low 190s, right? At one point, I think it was like 40 laps or so into a run. They're on board with Kevin Harvick. He's going 187 down into turns 3 and 4. He's on the bottom of the racetrack. In the middle of the corner, his slowest speed in the corner was 127 miles per hour. He had to slow down a full 60 miles an hour to then get back up and go back up to 187 down the straightaway. Nowadays, with the next gen car, if they go 20 miles an hour slower compared to the end of the straightaway to the middle of the corner, that's kind of exciting. Back then, 20 miles an hour is not anything when you look at what the COT did, where it's like they were going 50 to 60, sometimes even more than that, speed difference from the end of the straightaway to the middle of the corner. Very low grip, very low downforce car once again. And something I never really thought about until it was brought up here because of the comparisons being made because it was the first season of the COT. Not saying the Gen 4 wasn't hard to drive, because it was still a very low downforce car and a very hard car to drive. It just had a little bit more downforce than the COT. And it just kind of it's just interesting to think about how the COT was lower downforce than the Gen 4, something I would not have thought of, and something I didn't really think of until it was mentioned. And then think about it, I'm like, yeah, it is. It actually is lower downforce. That's crazy to think about. And to continue on with the comparison of Gen 4 to COT. Multiple times during the season, especially ESPN, there were discussions and arguments about how they needed to fix the COT car to improve the racing.
Putting everyone into the test today, guys. The drivers, the owners, the crew chiefs trying to figure out how to keep these cars dialed in.
I tell you, before we had the first race here, we had a lot of tire issues, but right now it looks like there's no tire issues, except they just can't get any grip whatsoever. And I guess the thing that amazes me, guys, they just keep, you're looking at Dale Earnhardt Jr. there. He takes that car and puts it right up against a wall and no room for error. I mean, I don't think if I had a car that was that bad at the moment, I keep it off the wall, maybe 4 or 5 foot, but it's not only Dale Jr., it's many drivers that just keeps clobbering his wall. And Brad, I guess the good thing is this car is so tough they can run in the wall and keep on going.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple of guys have even picked up some speed, but I think we have to kind of give Goodyear a little bit of a break here. It looks like it's more of a combination of the car and the racetrack that's creating the problems. We watch them run other racetracks, Ray, of a 1.5 mile length, and they don't seem to have any problem like they're having right now. These guys look like they're driving on ice.
Well, guys, I've said over and over again, in a situation like this where you've got a track with high speed, it's abrasive, and that COT car is different. It's a high center of gravity. It's heavy. I don't think they're going to fix problems at stuff like this in the size of the tire that we have now. We've got to make some changes to give these guys. I bet you after the race, I'm willing to bet that there's going to be some drivers still not happy. But again, I don't believe that's all Goodyear's fault. They're working within the box they've been given.
And Ray, we're not hearing anything bad about tire wear from what we're seeing come off the cars. But from you and Rusty, the guys there, what would you do to be able to fix a car not to punish these tires so much?
Well, I've always been a big advocate, Jerry, about this bump stop issue. I'm going to go right back at it again. I don't like that rule. Ray and I were talking before we started the broadcast here, and he doesn't like it either. There's just no room for error. It's such a fine line to get the car handling right, Ray. And I think until they make a change with this, we're going to be suffering through these type of problems at tracks like this.
Well, bump stops are very abrupt. They don't travel a lot. They gain rate immediately, and it just wears the tire. It abuses it. It sends constant shocks through a car. So if you've got a racetrack that is a little bit abrasive and a little bit bumpy, that car's just like bouncing along on hockey pucks.
Hey, Ray, it's Dale. I know there's been a lot of talk about just a wider wheel, which would widen the patch of the tire out a little bit and put more of that patch on. Have you heard anything about NASCAR following through with that?
I've not heard exactly about NASCAR following through with it, and a little bit of width would help, but really the tire, I believe, needs to be bigger in overall circumference, so it gives just a little bit more to lean on. If we're going to continue on bump stops, let's put a little bit more cushion in the sidewall of these tires, and I think Goodyear could have a little bit more area to work in with the construction if the car were a little bit taller.
The NASCAR has come out and said, we're not planning to make any changes in this car for next year. So again, all of you drivers and crew chiefs got to put your hats on and say, okay, if this is the box we're going to work with, we got to figure out a way to make it work.
Well, I got a feeling they've been doing that all year long, Alan. They've been working like crazy trying to get this thing figured out. You got to remember one thing, folks. This tire, this wheel size, we've had it for a long, long time and haven't had these problems until we got this brand new design car. I think a NASCAR needs to give a little bit and say, hey, look, we got to make a change. I know there's no rules for next year, no changes. But, Brad, I think they got to do something.
Well, I think it's obvious because we come back this time and we're seeing the same issue. Goodyear even gave us a tire that's got a little more grip on the right sides to try to stave off some of the problems we had last time with no grip. That tire wore away in 10 laps. As soon as the fuel's burned off, we're right back to the same thing. We got guys almost wrecking on the straightaways. Something has to be done.
I thought when you started talking about changes to the new car, DJ would be jumping up and down up there because that's a favorite of his.
Well, what do we have now with the current generation of car but a wider tire and a bigger tire? And what do we want? We want the old tire back. Isn't it funny how things always seem to just kind of come and go, right? Back at the beginning of the COT, we were like, man, we need a wider tire, a bigger tire to give them more grip and more to lean on. Now when we have that, we're going, oh, they have way too much to lean on. I think we need that narrow tire back. It's just really funny to me. It is really funny to me, some of the discussions. Immediately, the ESPN was like, oh my God, we need to make changes. And NASCAR was like, teams can figure it out. And it just reminds me so much of some of the current generation of car, the Gen 7 car, except for the fact that TV networks haven't really called out the car that much nowadays, right? Like Fox and NBC don't really call the car out. I guess maybe NBC did a little bit with the parts breaking last season, but it wasn't really like to the extent of like NASCAR needs to fix this. This is terrible. This, back then they were like, this is awful. It's going to be terrible. The race is going to be terrible if they don't fix it. Speaking of fixing stuff, tire problems in 2008. Once again, a new car and you have tire problems. Oh, it's 2022. Indianapolis, Talladega, Martinsville were the three races, all in the ESPN portion of the season, where tire problems just were terrible. So Indy, we all know the story there. Goodyear didn't really do that much testing at Indianapolis, and they really needed more practicing for the tires because it ended up they couldn't run more than like 15 green flag laps straight. And if they ran anything more than that, they were butchering tires and trying to kill people. So everyone knows the story of that. The worst Brickyard 400 ever. The Talladega race, the Talladega Chase race, was an interesting one where people, I think it was like 4 to 5 guys, had tire issues. One of them was, I think, Brian Vickers. He was up at the front of the pack battling for second place and caused a big crash. On the backstretch, Mike Wallace cut a tire, I think it was, and sent shrapnel flying. But the biggest one was Denny Hamlin leading on the bottom of the racetrack, cutting right front tire, and smacked the outside wall super hard, and actually ended up going to a hospital and I think staying overnight just to get evaluated. He was actually in that much pain and whatnot. It was that hard of a hit. But the interesting part was that in interviews when drivers were being asked about the tire issue, I think it was Junior said something like, yeah, I don't know what the tire issue is because they were having the issues with the Hoosiers in ARCA, and now we're having the same issues here. It must be something with the surface, which was interesting to me because Talladega was repaved in 06, and they didn't have issues in 06. They didn't have issues in either 07 race, and the second 07 race had the COT car. They didn't have issues in the first 08 race. Why were there issues that weekend? I still don't think there was ever an answer to that. And it's weird because we never had issues there again with tires. Neither from Hoosier nor Goodyear. Just a little weird. And then Martinsville wasn't necessarily a Goodyear issue, but more that like in the chase race at Martinsville, there were the green flag runs were so long, it was the same guys cutting tires down after like 50 laps. So like I think when a run, Kyle Busch cut a tire, came to pit road, the run kept going on because they kept it green, and then he went back out and cut a tire again like 50 laps later and had to come back to pit road. It was the same guys having issues all day long, and it just got annoying. I mean, that's the only reason I put it up there. It actually wasn't like a Goodyear issue. It was just like teams were doing stuff with camera and whatnot, and it just didn't work and caused a whole bunch of tire issues. So if you want to avoid tire issues, avoid those 3 races because they were chock full of tire issues, whether it be Goodyear's fault or the team's fault. Now moving on to maybe the craziest race of 2008. Not the best race, but the craziest race, the 2008 Coca-Cola 600. And possibly the craziest Coca-Cola 600 ever. Why do I say that? Well, the race was dominated by no one. A 400-lap race had Dale Earnhardt Jr. lead the most laps at 76. That is 19% of the laps run. The guy who led the most laps led 19% of the laps. 76 of 400. Other drivers who led laps. So we had Earnhardt. Kane led 66. Kurt Busch led 64. Kyle Busch led 61. Brian Vickers led 61. Jimmy Johnson led 35. Tony Stewart led 23. All those guys got to the front on pure pace and held the lead for a good stretch of laps. The leader's jinx was so intense during this race. We talk about the 2022 Coke 600 being so crazy and amazing and wonderful. The 08 Coke 600 was so much crazier. Earnhardt Jr. from the lead cuts a tire and gets nailed by J.J. Yeley in turns 3 and 4. The car is all messed up. but somehow comes away to finish inside the top 5 because of fuel. Kasey Kahne was like the only one that didn't have issues that led that race. Kurt Busch had pit issues and whatnot, and went to the back, fell laps down, got the laps back, but he led most of his laps early on, but couldn't get back to the front. Kyle Busch had some issues on pit road. He fell back to the mid-pack. Brian Vickers led a lot of laps, but unfortunately had a tire come off while at the front of the field, and his tire ended up going into the infield. Jimmy Johnson was leading, then about 5 laps later blew an engine, and Tony Stewart was coming around to take the white flag with the lead and ended up having a flat tire from the lead with a huge gap and lost the race and finished 18th a lap down. So no one could hold the lead. Somehow Kasey Kahne ended up with the victory. Probably the craziest Coke 600 ever. The craziest I've watched for sure. Bumpy Daytona. Bumpy Daytona's fun. The 08 Daytona 500 is a very underrated Daytona 500. Not that many caution flags. I think it was like 7 cautions. The field would get strung out on long green flag runs. There was still the ability to make passes, and then the end was pretty good because they stayed packed up, but it was still about handling, stuff like that. That was fun. I really want to talk about, though, the summer Daytona race, the 4th of July Daytona race. Bumpy Daytona at night under like the in the summer was just magical. And in 08, it was pretty good, the Coke Zero 400. It would get strung out pretty quickly, right? But handling mattered. See guys move through the field because they had handling. They were running all in different lines. It's amazing to watch what Daytona races were like back then, where it's not just, 2 rows of 2 wide and they just kind of run like that full throttle. Back then, they're running like up against the wall. Some are running at the bottom, and it's like so spread out through the corners, and they all come together to get the draft on the straightaway. One thing I want to bring up is that towards the middle portion of the race, Kyle Busch was one of the fastest cars up there with like Earnhardt Jr. and some of them. He was up at the front. He got spun onto the apron in turn 3, saved the car, but had to slow the car down and lost the pack, right? He's out of the draft. He went from up inside the top 5 or so, way back in the 30s, out of the draft, and I'm like, well, that sucks for Kyle. I wonder how he gets back up here and wins the race. Shockingly, the race stayed green, and he ran the pack down without draft. Yes, he ran guys down that had draft without draft. How did he do it? Because Bumpy Daytona is badass, right? It is the best mix of natural racing, but also that close quarters, super speedway type racing. It was amazing. So Kyle Busch, without draft, drove himself back up into the pack. And then, by himself, drove his way up inside the top 15 before yellow came out. Once again, he did all that without pit stops or without a caution flag, all under green. It's amazing. It is absolutely amazing what they used to be able to do at Daytona, and I really wish that the track could get back to that at some point, because the races are so fun to watch. And that summer race probably would have been one of the best races of the season, if not the best race of the season, if not for the fact that the end turned into a little bit of a shit show with a bunch of crashes and accidents, whatnot. Kind of tipped the rating down a little bit, but it was still a very good race. And if there's ever a better quality version of it that gets put up on YouTube, I definitely recommend watching it, even if you want to watch the poor quality version. But I really hope that a good quality version of it gets put up on YouTube, because it's a very good race and a very fun one to watch, and it has TNT's wide open coverage. You can't beat TNT's wide open coverage during that time, where you just had local commercials like once an hour or something, or once every 45 minutes, whatever it was. Speaking of really good races, let's go to the best race of the season, and the only one that I gave a 90 rating in the 90s. And that was the second Richmond race, which was the cutoff for the chase. While there wasn't that much chase drama involved in it, some little instances of oh my god, this person might miss it. But I mean, the guys that were trying to get in sucked so bad it didn't matter. But the racing itself was amazing. It was scheduled to be a Saturday night race, got rained out to Sunday afternoon. That racing in the day at Richmond at that point, absolutely amazing. They were running all the way down at the yellow line, all the way up against the wall. And the comers and goers were insane. I mean, it was an absolutely great race, and the only issue I have with it is that it didn't really have that many long green flag runs because there were so many cautions. The longest run was 54 laps, and that was the second run of the race, unfortunately, because the race was very, very good on longer runs. But you had so many different drivers once again get up there and lead. Like David Ruman led the most laps. Earnhardt Jr. was so good in the long runs, he'd fall back a few seconds on a shorter run and then gain it all back on a long run because he was so good. Kevin Harvick was always good. Kyle Busch was good. Jimmy Johnson ended up winning. Tony Stewart, he and Tony had a very good battle right down to the wire. That was a fun one to watch. You know, Jeff Gordon, Martin Truex Jr. were pretty fast during the race as well. Denny Hamlin was too. So it was just a fun race. And I'm not saying that as a Dale Jr. fan, you know, it wasn't just good because Dale Jr. wrecked Kyle Busch in Payback. It was good because the racing was actually good. They were, oh man, I could rave about this race for a long time. It was very, very good. They, once again, they were running all over the racetrack, and tire wear was so good, and the comers and goers on long runs was insane. If you want to watch a single race from 2008, that is the race I recommend. The 2008 Chevy Rock and Roll 400. Go look it up. Go watch it. Very good race overall. You will not be disappointed. It combines some very good Richmond racing in terms of like, you know, that how it's kind of like the intermediate of short tracks. It combines that with the short track craziness, and I think it's nearly the perfect combination. If there were just a few less caution flags, I think it would have been probably up around like 94, 95. It was that good of a race. It was very fun. I think that's the best rated Richmond race I've watched. I think the previous high was like 84 or something. I think that's the highest now, the new highest. Maybe it was 84, 85. Now it's 90. So that's cool. Unfortunately, I now have to go to the bad races. And by bad, I mean horrible races. So the 5 races that I gave below a 50. The second Phoenix race, the first Richmond race, Darlington, the first Dover, and Indianapolis. We know why Indianapolis is down there. The first Dover race was terrible. I think there was one on-track pass for the lead, and it was a teammate letting a teammate pass. And even behind the leader, there was not that good of racing. It was a bad race. It was a terrible race. It was awful. Don't watch it. Darlington, the first race on new pavement. It was awful. Darlington is not meant for high grip. With how narrow it is, you can't pass. And yeah, I mean, there were a lot of different leaders and a lot of cars on the wall and stuff like that. But it was like a 550 race with the COT. It wasn't good. In fact, it was so bad. After the race, they interviewed Dale Jr. and he said, "You could not pass at all. It was the worst it's ever been." Yeah. I think that's all you have to say about Darlington. The first Richmond race, it was not bad because Kyle Busch wrecked Dale Jr. It was just bad. Denny dominated. That's a theme of 2008 is that there were a lot of races that one person just dominated. But yeah, and then once Denny had the issue with the flat tire, which, I mean, that sucks for him because he led like 380 whatever laps of the 400 laps and ended up having a flat tire in the final like 20, which sucks. But then he stopped on track to cause a yellow, which I think is bullshit. And then that's what led to the Kyle and Jr. drama. That's the only thing the race had going for it was the end thing with Kyle and Dale Jr. There was nothing else. But before that, it was just Denny Hamlin dominating and not too many comers and goers through the field. It's a complete contrast to the first Richmond race of the season. The second Phoenix race wasn't that bad. I gave it a 46 out of 100. It was just bad enough that the 48 team was really good and there weren't that many battles for position behind. The weird thing about 2008 is that, as I mentioned during like Richmond and whatnot, there were a lot of races where one driver just went out there and led a bunch of laps, right? Like thinking back to it, I look at some of the races Edwards won, like both Texas races. He was pretty dominant. At Richmond, as I mentioned, Denny Hamlin led a lot of laps. There were only 4 lead changes in that one. At Darlington, Kyle Busch was good pretty much all throughout. At Dover, Kyle Busch was amazing. It just keeps going on and on about like just one driver leading a bunch of laps. And the Bristol night race is one that I find weird. A lot of people look back fondly on that one, and I do not see why. I did not see why. I gave it a 60 out of 100. It was maybe the worst Bristol race I've ever watched. There were 4 lead changes. Kyle Busch led like 300 whatever straight laps. I'm going to go find the number right now. Hold on. He led over 300 laps straight. Let's look at this. Oh, sorry, not 300. No, excuse me, 415 straight laps. He led from lap 55 to lap 469, and the only reason he got passed was a bump from Carl Edwards. And then the poor man almost didn't even get second because Denny got up there and almost passed him. But it wasn't good. It was a bad race. Like, I know it had like the bump and run for the win at the end, but it just wasn't good. I mean, the only drivers who led laps, Carl Edwards, Kyle Busch, Jeff Gordon. And Jeff Gordon led one lap. Two drivers led 499 of the 500 laps, and the racing wasn't that good. Like, you could be like, oh, well, the racing behind was good. The racing behind was okay. It wasn't like a 9 out of 10 type race behind. It was like a 7 out of 10 race behind that then got reduced down to a 6 out of 10 because the battle for the lead was non-existent all night. Yeah, I don't get why people actually love that one. I don't know. Yeah, it's just like there were a lot of races where I'm fine with 3 drivers dominating a season, like in 2018, because it's fun if it's 3, right? If it's like, oh, 1 driver is dominating the season, it's not fun. If 3 drivers obviously everyone wants to see like, oh, I want to see 7 drivers in contention for the championship or up there battling for the points lead, right? But in reality, that's rarely going to happen, and the more you try to force that to happen, as mentioned recently, in terms of current day NASCAR, it's not going to produce the best racing because if everyone's running the same speed, how is anyone going to pass? So while you want parity, you want a type of parity like we saw with the COT days, where it was like there were guys that showed up to the track on it, right? There were like 3 guys. Or 1. Sometimes there was only 1 guy that showed up and you're like, that's the guy to beat. Sometimes you show up, there's like 3 guys that are the guys to beat, right? But it's not like you showed up and you're like, well, any of these 15 drivers could win this race because everyone's cars are running the same, right? It's like, all right, you have a few drivers that are very, 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 very good, and they're the ones to beat. Then you have the next 5 to 8 guys that are pretty good and could get up there and lead if things happen to those 3. And then you have, kind of the rest of the field where it's like, they fall into tiers, and that's what kind of makes it fun is that every week the tiers would change with the track, and it's like, oh, here at Pocono this guy was good, and then the next week at Michigan this guy's sucking. Like, he just went up there and ran 3rd at Pocono, now he's running back in like 24th at Michigan. What happened? Well, it's just the different tracks and whatnot. But the weird thing about 2008 is that 3 drivers dominated the season: Carl Edwards, Jimmy Johnson, Kyle Busch. We know them, right? They're the original big 3. There were rarely any races where those guys were the ones that were battling for the win amongst themselves, right? So often when they won races, they weren't battling with each other, and they had no one to battle because of it. The only one that really comes to mind and jumps out to me as like, this guy had to battle with another one of the big 3 members was Chicago, where Kyle had to battle Jimmy for the win at the end and throughout the race. That was a pretty good race. But then you have races like Texas and Atlanta, where it's like, oh, Carl went up there and dominated and never looked back. The first Atlanta race, Kyle went up there and, Carl was battling him, but then blew an engine and no one could battle with Kyle. It was kind of weird how the big 3 were never the big 3 together. They were the big 3 at different races of the season. And that's kind of what happened with 2018 for a lot of it, was like, during the first half of 2018, Kyle was good this race, but Kevin and Truex weren't. But then Truex was good this race, and Kyle and Kevin weren't, right? And then as the season went on, Chicago, all of them were pretty good. New Hampshire, all of them were very good. And it kept going on and on where it's like, oh, well, the big 3, they're starting to race with each other more, and that kind of makes the season better. It sucks when you have 3 drivers dominating, but they're all dominating at different points and at different races, and it doesn't really help in terms of the racing quality. So, yeah, that was 2008. Not much more to say about it. Average season. I wouldn't go back and watch it. I'd just go back and watch like Richmond, the Daytona races. The Kansas race was fun. Even, everyone knows the Kansas race for Carl's video game move in the final corner, but the racing even before that was fine. So, yeah, that's about all I have for 2008. I'll probably go back and watch 2007 now. It would be my first season of any type of Gen 4 racing. I've watched, like, a few Gen 4 races here and there, but I've never watched a full season of Gen 4, so that could be fun to go back and watch. I know 07 is a Chevy-dominated season, so, especially Hendrick, Gordon, and Jimmy, so have to go back and see how that ranks and if the racing quality is any good or whatnot. So, yeah, that's it for 08. Thanks for watching if you made it this far, and I'll see you guys for the next video.